So you've got to find other sources of information. And fortunately now, there's a lot of other sources of information on the internet. And I would encourage you to go to www.nra.org, which is our website, and you can get answers to a lot of those questions, including answers to, where firearm safety courses are being held, to, the political stuff as well. So thank you for asking that.
I want to respond to this question too, because I think it's a really important question. And I want to use an example that don't have a gut reaction to this, because I'm not going to say what you think I'm going to say in the beginning. Do you know why most Palestinians love Hamas? They love Hamas because Hamas is the largest provider of soccer leagues in the Palestinian territory, and medical care, and social structures. But we know Hamas as a terrorist organization because that's the essence of how it affects the world. Now, I am not, and this is what I cautioned you against, suggesting that the NRA is a terrorist organization. But what I am suggesting is that it is disingenuous to say that the NRA should be known mainly as a gun education training organization when its biggest impact on the country is stalling gun laws. Just as it is disingenuous for me to embrace Hamas because they provide soccer leagues. I'll also say one other thing. I'm not a criminologist, so I don't know whether diversity causes these crimes. Let's pretend for a second that it is, or let's stipulate that it is. Diversity is not going away. This country is becoming more and more and more diverse. Anyone who has been on this campus for any period of time will know that this campus in the last handful of years has become more and more diverse. Grand Forks has become more and more diverse. So if the response is gun control, that gun laws work best in a homogeneous population, then the people who say that don't even belong in the conversation, because they're describing a country that no longer exists. Whatever solution we come to is going to have to be a solution that embraces and celebrates the reality of diversity and figures out how to deal with that. So that's my response. It was a good question.
Yeah, you got to turn it on. Sorry. Just talk really loud, then.
My question. Weinstein. I guess I didn't come to hear a lot of statistics. I came more for the philosophical point-counterpoint kind of a debate. I want to frame this in a context that many other people might understand. And if you decline to answer the question or would prefer not, I understand. What happened in North Dakota the day before yesterday with the abortion laws, did that strike a chord with your point of view? I guess just a yes or no answer.
Yeah, well, here's what he's asking. He's asking if I'm liberal. That's what he's asking. No,
I'm asking if the decision to limit or to further restrict what is considered, what's a legal abortion or not.
Here is what concerns me. It concerns me that there is a tremendous population in the state that feels it's not being listened to. And that I have talked to many women who identify themselves as practicing Catholic, who identify themselves as conservative, who feel that their voices have been ignored. I think that when that happens, there's a public policy failure, and I think that that's true if the decision was reversed. So I'm not going to compare abortion to gun control. And I'm certainly not at the moment, although I would happily do elsewhere, assert a position on abortion policy in North Dakota. Here's what concerns me. What concerns me is that we in this country right now, are so used to disregarding people's opinions because of what political point of view we think they hold or what party we think they belong in, that we forget to talk about the ideas. So if you want to make a more explicit connection philosophically with abortion and gun control, I'm happy to address it. But my personal opinion about North Dakota public policy issues is irrelevant.
Very good, and you've done a very good point of framing the question to bring it back to my point, which is, Roe versus Wade set approximately a 24-week time frame on what abortion was allowed. Now it could be 6 weeks, 8 weeks. We're not sure. The fact is they restricted that in North Dakota, and that upsets many, many people because now it doesn't allow people with the opportunity to choose. It restricts on the rights of those that really don't feel that they need the restriction. Is abortion outlawed? No, it's not. You can still get an abortion in North Dakota before the term of viability, as far as I understand it. But what I'm saying is I'm trying to liken this to another issue that other people might understand is it should be about personal responsibility and the availability of people to choose and to have the government out of their private lives. That's just the point I'm trying to make.
Okay, well, your understanding of what viability is in a baby is incorrect, and your understanding of how the abortion bills work are incorrect, but that's neither here nor there. Here's what I propose. Let's have a waiting period exactly as long as a woman is required to keep a baby in her body. Let's use the 24-week Roe versus Wade standard and say, okay, let's have a 24-week waiting period before someone can get a gun. Ms. Froman you talked about the First Amendment and said, we don't have a test for voting rights. No, we don't have a test for voting rights. But we do require ID, photo IDs in many places, proof of residency, and other such things. All of our rights are compromised, and all of our rights are structured in such a way that they fit with our society. So if your position is going to be, Jack, if you disagree with me on abortion, I'm not going to listen to you on gun rights, then your professors have failed you. Because that's not how it works. It's just not how it works.
Thank you for that. And I totally opened a can of worms, but I anticipated that. I'm just trying to liken it to something that other people...
Hey, no. If you don't like it, you can leave. Hey, great, thank you. Hey, wait. I'm in charge. You can follow up what you're saying, and then I'm going to take your mic.
No,
I'm in charge.
I was just trying to frame it in, because I also, like you mentioned in the beginning, I'm a libertarian, not because I came to law school with that, but that's kind of what I've picked up on. And I very much appreciate the fact that everybody should be personally responsible.
Oh, sure. And the only consistent, this is, and my relationship with libertarianism is very, very complicated. But the only consistent libertarian point of view is pro-choice. By definition. So if we want to have a conversation about libertarian attitudes about the role of the state and all of that kind of stuff, then that's a conversation I'd be thrilled to have because I love talking about libertarianism. But the only consistent position of a libertarian is pro-choice and is completely pro-choice. The North Dakota position on abortion is not libertarian by any stretch of the imagination. So yeah. So.
Go ahead. I'm sorry, it should be on. Sorry, we pay the bills, I swear. I don't.
There's a light on. Can you hear me?
Go ahead.
There we go. Okay. My question is more, I guess, towards the representative of the NRA. Have the courts and also the NRA advocate for either a legal position or a policy restricting access to certain types of weapons? So my question is basically, has there been a line or many lines drawn in the sand saying that this type of weapon is okay, but not this kind. Like for example, I don't imagine it would be legal for me to be walking around with weapons-grade plutonium, but a handgun, would be okay. Granted, those are two extremes, but what have the courts said, and what does the NRA kind of advocate for?
Well, basically, if you read the Heller case, which I really would encourage you all to do, it's a fascinating opinion. It's not that long, and it's about a topic that might be more interesting than, let's say, administrative law. You'll find that they do talk about. Now, let me back up and say, the holding of the court in that opinion is narrower than the subjects that they talk about in the opinion. There's talk about the fact that the decision, or the holding that the court makes shouldn't change the longstanding belief that felons shouldn't own guns, that the mentally ill who have violent tendencies shouldn't own guns, that certain guns that are considered quote-unquote dangerous in the way they're used, that those prohibitions would still be valid, that there might be some what they call sensitive places like schools and government buildings where you don't have your Second Amendment rights to have whatever you want. So the answer is yes, and that's why I said earlier that there's a huge field open now for courts and lawyers to litigate over what is constitutionally protected, what is not. And it's not only the gun, but it might be the activity. For example, as I said earlier, the collecting of firearms as opposed to using them in self-defense might be subject to a lesser level of scrutiny. Clearly, self-defense, I think, is going to be subject to a strict scrutiny test from a constitutional law standpoint, whereas something like collecting might be subject to a lesser test. And the same is true of the First Amendment. I mean, if commercial speech is subject to a lesser level of scrutiny than basically core First Amendment, let's say political speech or something.
Before we go to the next question, if you have something to say, you can, okay, I'm sorry. Let's keep it in order, and I'm at discretion to who speaks or not. We will have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 more speakers, sorry. So, and that'll be it. So next, gentleman in the back.
Yeah, this question is for both. I was just looking at a map of America, and then I started seeing that most of the crime is in Florida and I think Washington, D.C. Those are relatively densely populated states compared to most other states. And then when you look at Florida, it shows that it's the most densely populated parts which have the most amount of crime, and I'm guessing the violent crime, and that's associated with guns, or maybe not. But at either the federal government or, independent institutions like the NRA, are they trying to tackle reduction in crime, whether it's, I guess, gun or non-gun? But in the case of NRA, it would be with respect to guns, based on density of the population.
Well, that's a really good question, and it raises an issue, which is, gun crime. If you do look at a map of the United States or any given state, you'll see that gun crime, violent crime with guns, is higher in the urban areas, densely populated areas, and areas with a real diverse population, and it's less in rural areas, more homogeneous areas, and areas where people have a lot of land. It's just a fact of life. And you'll see, if you go to the South, let's say the Democratic South, you'll find a lot of, guns there because a lot of people still hunt there. So they're used to having guns. I think what's happened is in our society, when I grew up, I was born and raised in San Francisco. I didn't own guns. My family didn't own guns. My family didn't hunt. I didn't know anybody who shot a gun. It was completely, not part of my life. And I was 32 years old before I ever shot a gun. And so what's happened is, contrary to when America was young and people were literally hunting for their food, or you had to have a gun to keep the fox out of the hen house, or to repel, invaders, two-legged invaders even, people were much more familiar with guns. What's happened is people are not as familiar with guns these days. So there's a lot of misconceptions about how guns operate, which guns are, quote, more powerful. People just don't know because they don't have experience. They're ignorant, and I don't mean that in a bad way. They just don't have any experience with firearms. So in the rural areas where there's more experience with firearms, I think there tends to be less gun crime. And yes, the NRA does a lot to try to address these issues. One of the programs that the NRA had many years ago now, and we've tried very hard to introduce into other cities, is something that started in Richmond, Virginia, called Project Exile. And what it was a collaboration between local law enforcement authorities, the Virginia State Police, and the federal government, the U.S. Attorney's Office, where we would prosecute gun crime to the fullest extent of the law. People would not get to plea bargain away gun crimes. And if you were a felon in possession of a gun, you were basically sent to prison for the maximum sentence. That alone wasn't enough, but what happened was when it started to get publicized and the city of Richmond got the business community together to put ads on the side of city buses that said things like, use a gun, go to jail, Project Exile. When the criminals got wind of that and they realized that they weren't going to get to plea bargain away their crimes committed with firearms, they stopped using guns in the commission of their crimes. Or if they did have a gun, as soon as they thought that they were at risk, they would throw it away. They would get rid of it. So these kinds of law enforcement efforts can make a difference, but it requires a concerted effort. Right now, federal prosecutions of gun crimes are way down. And Vice President Biden, when he was asked, well, why don't you prosecute the people who lie on the federal form, the 4473 that you have to fill out to buy a firearm, why don't you prosecute the people who lie on it? His answer was, we don't have enough resources to prosecute people who lie on those federal forms. Why? If the government doesn't have enough resources to prosecute people who lie when they're trying to get a gun, then what good are the rest of these gun laws going to do if prosecutions are way down? So I think that we do need to make sure that laws which exist today are being vigorously prosecuted, and people who break those laws go to jail, and they go to jail for a long time. The law-abiding people who may, inadvertently break a law, maybe they need to be dealt with by the judges who see those cases, with some kind of understanding that this person who doesn't have a criminal record and they, maybe they did something that they weren't supposed to do, but it didn't endanger anyone. They didn't have any criminal intent. Hopefully you've all had criminal law and you know the difference between basically crimes that are crimes of, moral crimes and crimes that are administrative law crimes. And I think there's a big difference there. And what's happening is that a lot of people who get caught up in paperwork violations, but who really don't have any criminal intent, are getting caught up in the system.
The speakers, are you okay with more questions? I know we've gone over 10.
I'm perfectly fine with it.
Go ahead.
Two things. The first is that the reason why there aren't enough resources is that for the last 20 some odd years, people have been asking for smaller and smaller government and refusing and wanting lower and lower taxes. I mean, just think about what would be involved in an investigation to see if someone lied on a form, right? You'd need you need an office with enough personnel to read carefully the form. Then you'd need, at minimum, someone to call them up and ask questions, possibly to go to their town and investigate. So if the NRA is in favor of bigger government and larger taxes, then it'd be great if they came out to say that, because there are a lot of people who would join the NRA for that. Now, I want you to notice what she did, though. She said, for the third or fourth time today, that states with gun control, with more gun control, have higher crime. And then she talks about rural versus urban. Criminologists have no idea what causes crime. Criminologists spend their entire careers arguing for this. Is gun control a factor? It may be, it may not be. But let's talk about rural life for a second, because a lot of you have grown up in rural towns in North Dakota. Why aren't you robbing the gas station? Well, in part because the gas station owner knows who you are. The gas station owner has known you are since you were 6 weeks old. That the town, the community, you go to the same churches, you go to the same schools. There are towns in North Dakota where 4 or 5 towns will go to the same middle school, right? Now, does that stop you from committing a crime? Maybe. Maybe it doesn't. I don't know. Criminologists don't know. If you live in a sparsely populated area and someone isn't cutting you off when you're driving down the street, or getting to a fight with you in a supermarket, or flashing their money, or whatever may cause crime, there's not going to be crime. Densely populated areas are complicated places. In New York City, the way that you protect people's personal space is by not looking them in the eye. In North Dakota, if you're walking down the street and you don't look someone in the eye, they think you're horrible and rude, right? No one knows what causes crime. No one knows what causes crime. And I will get every single criminal justice professor at this university to endorse that statement. No one knows what causes crime. Are gun control laws a factor? Are liberal gun laws a factor? Maybe. We don't know. But if somebody tells you that those correlations represents causations, they're trying to get you to join their organization. They're not talking about the truth. The truth is we have no idea.
We're going to have it two more questions. You were next. I'm sorry, actually you were next, and then you, and then no more questions. Sorry, but that's the way it is. Thank you.
I may have lost your first question there. You were talking about homogeneity in Mexico. Well, living so close to the border, I can tell you one of the two big problems in Mexico is one is corruption, and the other one is poverty. And those obviously are going to have a major effect on what happens in that country and the spillover into the United States. If you go to Tucson, Arizona, for example, there is a huge population of Mexican people and U.S. citizens who came from Mexico who are quiet, who live quiet lives every day, send their kids to school, do their jobs, whatever. They are obviously not the problem, but there's another group of people who are more involved in some of the stuff that goes on across the border that are a problem. So it's hard to, you can't really, in good faith, I think, make conclusions about people as a whole, but I am, when I talk about the homogeneity issue, I'm talking about what this book says. I'm not a criminologist, but I'm talking about what this book says, and I would encourage you to get it and read it. The fellow who wrote the book, Dave Kopel, has written a lot on Second Amendment issues and is a very well-regarded lawyer and legal scholar, and I haven't read the book in a long time. But then the second question you raise has to do with high-capacity magazines, and I will tell you that, the question I get a lot is, why does anyone need a high-capacity magazine? And I say that we, civilians, need a high-capacity magazine for the same reason that law enforcement needs it or the military needs it, which is we may get into a situation where we have only what is on us, only what I have for self-defense. People, I think, are going down the wrong path if they try to regulate inanimate objects. I could put what we all agree might be the most scary looking gun on that table, and it could sit there for 10 years and it would never hurt anybody unless a bad person with criminal intent picked it up and pointed at someone and pulled the trigger. It is not the physical objects that are the problem. If you want to regulate physical objects, then we should be regulating fast cars. There's nothing in the Second Amendment about fast cars. I mean, it's just kind of silly to think that we can regulate inanimate objects and change people's behavior. We have to address people's behavior. I want to mention a couple of things here that have been said about some of these issues. Let's talk about gun buybacks for a minute. It says this, and I'm going to read you these statements and then ask you if, see if you know where these came from. One of them has to do with gun buybacks, which have been very popular in some jurisdictions. It says, gun buybacks are ineffective as generally implemented. The buybacks are too small to have an impact. The guns turned in are at low risk of ever being used in a crime, and replacement guns are easily acquired. Let's talk about magazine restrictions, especially high-capacity magazine restrictions, as this gentleman has raised. In order to have an impact, large-capacity magazine regulation needs to sharply curtail their availability to include restrictions on importation, manufacture, sale, and possession. An exemption for previously owned magazines, in other words, grandfathering in the hundreds of thousands of magazines already owned, would nearly eliminate any impact. The program would need to be coupled with an extensive buyback of existing large capacity magazines. With an exemption, the impact of the restrictions would only be felt when the magazines degrade. Remember, these are made of metal and they're pretty durable, or when they're no longer compatible with guns in circulation. This would take decades to realize. And that the third one has to do with the assault weapons ban, proposed assault weapons ban. Assault weapons are not a major contributor to U.S. gun homicide, and the existing stock of guns is large. Therefore, an assault weapons ban is unlikely to have an impact on gun violence. If coupled with a gun buyback and no exemptions, then it might be effective. These are not statements made by the NRA. These are statements that are in a January 4, 2013 memo that was produced by the National Institute of Justice, which is the research arm of the U.S. Department of Justice. So it's the current administration's view about the fact that some of these proposals that are being floated now in Congress will only be effective if we can have mandatory buybacks of magazines or rifles, and if we can have full gun registration so that the law enforcement entities know where the firearms are. That's what they say about these so-called universal background checks, is they won't work because we won't know whether people have complied with that law unless we know where the guns start out with. And then the last thing I'm going to say, because may be my last opportunity to say it, is I hope you've been aware of how many times Professor Weinstein has chosen to use his time to attack an organization as opposed to talking about the facts. I get this a lot. I've been personally attacked a lot. My life has been threatened a lot. And yet I still believe that if you look at the facts and if you think about these issues, each one of you, if you look at both sides of the question, will come to an understanding, I think, of this debate. And I don't necessarily expect everybody to agree with me. I very often don't agree with even my friends about some of these issues. But I do agree that we need to focus on looking at the issues and not on basically calling people names or even trying to demonize organizations. The NRA has been around since 1871. There's no organization that has done more for firearms safety and marksmanship training than the NRA. And for those of you who are NRA members, and I hope that some of you are, I think you know that. It doesn't necessarily mean that you have to agree with everything. In my family, we don't agree on everything. But what we do agree upon is that the debate be fair and informed, and that we don't reduce ourselves to name-calling. So thank you.
I want to talk about a couple things. I want to first, respond. I'm not quite sure why it's wrong to attack an organization in a democracy, in a pluralistic democracy where they take a public face. I certainly never attacked Ms. Froman. I could, but that's what the NRA is for. I attack UND in the newspaper, as many of you know. I attack all sorts of organizations. And now I'm going to attack language because she said something which really bothered me. She said, she's talking about Mexican spillover, and she said, as a compliment, there are a lot of Mexicans in Tucson, Arizona who lead quiet lives. And that really bothers me because what she meant, of course, was that they lead lawful lives. But what the implication, and I hope accidental, was that the best thing that a Mexican can do in Arizona is not call attention to themselves. And this is really important because at the heart of the difference between her point of view and my point of view is a worldview. And it's a worldview of how we think about other people. Are we afraid of other people or do we trust other people? I grew up in Washington Heights in New York City in the 1970s and 80s. In Washington Heights was the 34th precinct, which had the highest murder rate in New York City. It was the center point of distribution of crack for the East Coast. I have spent much of my life around drug dealers and drug users, around crime. I've seen it do terrible things to people. But when I am in a room with people, I don't see them as threats. I don't see the government as a threat. I understand that they're crazy people. I understand that they're criminals. I understand that you have to be aware of things. But at the heart of this debate is an attitude about civil society. That what political scientists have shown time and time again is that the fundamental issue in stability in a society is not whether you trust the government, but whether you trust other people. And the fundamental difference attitude between the position that she is uttering and the position that I am uttering is whether or not we trust our fellow Americans, whether or not we trust the people we live with, whether or not you are afraid of home invasion, of the government overstepping its bounds, of all of your rights being taken away in a mostly unprecedented way in this country. And I just don't share that point of view. So at the heart of this is a real philosophical disagreement, a disagreement about how we think about the government, about how we think about people. And I think that that ought to be brought out because for the most part, 99.9% of the people I encounter are trustworthy people, because if they weren't, I couldn't drive down the street. Because in order to drive down the street, I have to trust that the people going the other way are not going to swerve across the yellow line. And most people don't.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Let's give another round of applause.